Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the second International Philosophy Colloquium at Federal University of Santa Catarina. Welcome to the presentation of our special guest today, Professor Anya Plutynski. My name is Renata Ruda. Thanks, everyone, for being here, in particular, all of you female philosophers, our special guests. I would like to congratulate the organizing committee for such an important initiative, especially here in Brazil, where we still face a long path ahead to our effective insertion in the philosophy field, not only among us here in Brazil, but also internationally. I want to thank the organizing committee very much for inviting me here to be here and chair this session today. It's very special for me because I am also a philosopher of medicine and of epidemiology. So having the opportunity of being in touch with such an amazing scholar from an area of research, it's a great pleasure. The health sciences as a field raise many important epistemological questions and philosophical investigations, and that has been particularly noticed in these pandemic times. So today you have a special opportunity, and I'm deeply honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Anya Blitzky, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Washington University in St. Louis in the United States. She's a historian and philosopher of biology and medicine. Her current research is on the history of the Cancer Genome Atlas project and the development of precision oncology. Her research interests also include biomedical research ethics, particularly issues surrounding precision oncology, cancer genomics, and risk communication. She's a strikingly skilled biology. Actually, she also holds a master's in biology, which gives us a dimension of her expertise. Just a few weeks ago, the interdisciplinary project in which she's one of the coordinators have received a grant of $14 million. The main topic of the project is agents, directionality, and function, foundations for a science of purpose. And she's coordinating a cluster of researchers on agency and directionality in development. Professor Anna is part of the editorial board of many important journals in her field. She has many publications, articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries. She was also editor of some very important anthologies in philosophy of biology. Among her vast works, I would like to highlight her most recent book, Explaining Cancer, Find Order in Disorder, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, which made her the winner of the 2021 Lakatos Award for the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. I've counted, and from the 30 philosophers awarded along the entire award history, he was just the fourth woman to receive this prize. So we have lots of work to do everywhere in order to make our women philosophers work more visible. And actually, she's doing that. She was co-chair of the Women's Caucus of the Philosophy of Science Association, which, for example, provides mentoring for early career women philosophers, among other initiatives, to drawing attention to the work of these women. A couple of years ago, I came across a fantastic all-female authors syllabus of a course of philosophy of science, and that was organized by Anya Plutynski. It covers all the essential topics in philosophy of science with amazing female philosophers. There is definitely something to be done everywhere in the world with publications in different languages. Well, after all this introduction, thank you so much for being here talking about Whither philosophy of cancer for open questions. Professor Anya Plutynski, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here and excited to support women in philosophy in particular. So I'm going to talk today about, the origins of this book that I just wrote, Explaining Cancer, Finding Order and Disorder. And these are the 4 questions that I'm going to be answering along the way. So I'm going to talk about these 4 sort of core issues that I think are really interesting and important, growing in part out of my work. First, what tools are relevant to doing philosophical work on cancer? Second, how can philosophical work on cancer contribute to philosophy generally and to philosophy of science in particular? Third, how can philosophy of cancer engage cancer researchers, patients, families, and communities affected by cancer? And fourth, where do we need to go next? So as I understand, this conference was organized by graduate students, and there are lots of graduate student women who are excited and interested in opening up new fields and challenging standard approaches to philosophy. So I have some suggestions for interesting ideas, places to take new research. But I wanted to start by dedicating this talk to the women philosophers of science who inspired me. So this is Lisa Lloyd, Miriam Solomon, Evelyn Fox Keller, and Helen Longino. When I was an undergraduate and early graduate student, these were some of the women philosophers of science who inspired me to go into this field, because I saw how they had done some important work in showing how science is a social enterprise and how objectivity can be compromised by various forms of bias, and in particular, certain kinds of sexist bias. And Miriam Solomon, the second one, taught me my first feminist philosophy of science class as a graduate student. So I was really inspired by these women in part in my own work. And I think that the work in cancer and the ideas I'm proposing to you grow in part out of their inspiration as well. So I'm going to say a little bit about the book. I started this book about almost now 15 years ago, when I was first diagnosed with breast cancer. I was relatively young, and like most people, when you're first diagnosed with cancer, you have a lot of questions. Why me? Why did I get cancer, and why now? I had just had a little girl, my daughter here in this picture. I was healthy. I was never a smoker. I had no family history. And so I had lots of big questions about why I got cancer. And as an academic does, and as philosophers do, I just started reading. So the first thing I did is I went back and reread Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a really important and influential book, at least in the United States. It shaped a lot of environmental regulation in the 20th century. And I was really interested in understanding what kinds of environmental factors might play a role in cancer. And I also read a fantastic book by Sandra Steingraber that I recommend. That's a narrative of her own cancer journey, her diagnosis, her treatment, but also she's a PhD in biology, and she does a lovely job explaining some of the environmental science and biological science behind cancer causation. But this was just the beginning, and I started asking more questions, and I was really curious about what kinds of causes of cancer there were. And I was starting to realize that there were really interesting ways in which philosophical questions that I had asked in the context of philosophy of biology more generally might be applied in particular to cancer. So this takes me to one of the first questions that I posed of those 4 questions. What are the tools relevant to doing philosophical work on cancer? And for me, one of the first tools was, of course, my experience of cancer diagnosis and treatment. I think that going through the illness journey is really, at least for me, it was very important to understanding how there are all these complex decision points and gray areas in medicine that I didn't really realize before I was diagnosed and treated for cancer, that raised lots of really interesting epistemic questions for me about risk and benefit and harm that I just didn't realize before I went through it. And those experiences led to some of the questions that motivated and organized my book. I also just started sitting in on classes. I was at the time teaching at University of Utah, and so I started taking classes at the University of Utah School of Medicine in cell and molecular biology of cancer, in epidemiology, statistics. And I had some wonderful professors who were patient with my naive philosophical questions, which philosophers are well placed to ask of scientists. And these are some of the people that helped me and invited me to sit in on their lab meetings, to participate in public discussion. And I think that sort of being in these lab meetings, being in the lab, understanding some of these conversations gave me insights into the science behind cancer in ways that reading published work didn't. And I think that philosophers of science, one of the tools that they can use if they're interested in studying a particular scientific question or area would do well to sort of embed themselves in these communities and talk to the scientists, because there's a lot that you learn from talking to scientists that you can't really learn from published work. So as a result of this time that I spent studying and learning as much as I could about my own cancer diagnosis, but also cancer in general, I generated a series of questions that serve to organize the book. First of all, the first question that I think a lot of cancer patients have is when you get diagnosed, you're told you have stage X or grade Y of this cancer type or subtype. And as a philosopher, the first question I had was, are these classifications nature's joints? Are these natural kinds of things that we're picking out when we talk about grade 3 or grade 4? What does that really mean? So one of the first questions that organizes my book is how do cancer scientists classify cancer, and do these classifications reflect nature's joints? Another question that arose for me as a result in part of taking a fantastic epidemiology class was the realization that a lot of times in diagnoses, there are some sort of gray areas. And when you screen for cancer, you might find a lot of precancerous states that may or may not eventuate in metastasis and death. And so there's this challenge of weighing the costs and benefits of cancer screening. If you screen earlier or you screen more patients, you might find a lot of pre-cancerous states, and you might end up overdiagnosing and overtreating patients for cancers that might never have eventuated in metastasis and death. So a big question for me was, well, how do we then draw the line between a precancerous state and true cancer? And that was part of what sort of organized the second and third chapters of the book when I was thinking about, well, how do we just draw this line between cancer and non-cancer, disease and health? A big organizing question of the book also was how we think about cancer causation, and in particular, the role of genes in cancer, because it was fairly common in a lot of my medical school classes for the lecturer to stand up and say, cancer is a genetic or genomic disease. And as a philosopher of biology, I had a lot of questions about what that meant. When we say something is a disease, first of all, but then a genomic disease, what does that mean? And then, of course, I was also interested in the environmental causes of cancer and how and why evolution has left us vulnerable to cancer, and whether we ought to think of cancer itself as an evolutionary process. But you might think, well, what does all this have to do with philosophy? Why cancer? Why would that be an interesting topic for philosophers to be investigating? In fact, when I first mentioned the idea I had of writing a book to one of my colleagues, he said, well, what's philosophically interesting about that? And I think that there are lots of really interesting ways in which questions about cancer intersect with everything from metaphysics and epistemology to value theory. First and most obviously, cancer is one of the most common diseases. And in industrial countries, 1 in 2 individuals are likely to be diagnosed at some point in their lifetime. And so that's a pretty significant number of people who are affected. And questions about diagnosis and treatment decisions are complex decisions that involve a lot of epistemic questions and questions about inductive risk. But there's also a huge amount of science about cancer. And it turns out that that science about cancer, a lot of the research that people do that's funded for cancer, has actually led to some really important insights about the basic science of biology. So you might think that cancer is a sort of window into a lot of transformations in biological science over the course of the latter part of the 20th century. And I'm going to sort of unpack a little bit about what the philosophical interest in cancer is in a moment. But some of the tools, just unpacking a bit more, that I used in my research, in 2009, when I was first diagnosed, there weren't many philosophers writing about cancer. But now there are a lot of papers, books, articles, workshops like Pradeaux's workshop in philosophy of cancer research that are going on all the time. And I've actually created an open access Google Doc, which I'll provide a link to for anyone who wants it. It's here on the page with a long list of all the philosophical work on cancer today, as well as work by historians and sociologists of science who have been publishing important work on cancer. So there's a lot of work now to draw upon. But when I started, there wasn't. And so I went to history. So I was really trained more as a historian of philosophy and as a historian of science and medicine before I was really a philosopher of science. And so I find looking at the history of science incredibly useful to framing and thinking about some of these philosophical questions about cancer. In fact, I see history and philosophy of science as in an important dialectical relationship. And I don't think you can answer some philosophical questions about cancer without knowing a lot about the history of the science. For instance, it's very difficult to say whether a scientific idea is genuinely novel or a paradigm shift without a very thorough appreciation of a science's history. Scientists often write histories of their fields in science journals that have what historians call a Whig flavor, their Whiggish history, by which they mean everything is prelude to the present and historical figures are torn from their historical context. But one of Thomas Kuhn's lessons in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions was that once you situate thinkers in their historical context, you often see how and why they thought as they did. And so it's really important, I think, for philosophers of science to pay attention to the history of the science that they're investigating if they want to properly contextualize claims about, for instance, paradigm shifts or transformations in scientific inquiry or progress in science. And so this look into the history of science was really key to my investigating and framing the questions I did and answering them the way I did in my book. There were other very important tools that I relied upon coming from both history and philosophy of science. So these are just a few examples of works that I drew upon in my book. Dan Hausman has written some really important things about the nature of health and disease. There's fantastic work on risk or concepts of risk by people like Carl Craner and others. Peter Godfrey Smith's book on Darwinian populations and natural selection informed a lot of my thinking about cancer as an evolutionary byproduct and process, and Alex Broadbent's work on epidemiology. So there's a lot of wonderful things to draw on that sort of integrated a lot of this prior work on the epistemology of medicine and biology, as well as the metaphysics of the sciences. So Ali Khalidi's book, The Natural Kinds and Natural Categories in Human Kinds, is a target for one of my arguments in a central chapter of the book as well. So there are a lot of different ways of approaching questions in philosophy of science. And the sort of classic standard approach is to ask these questions in the abstract. I take myself to be very much in the camp of integrated history and philosophy of science, but I also draw upon philosophy in science in the sense that Prado and his colleagues at Bordeaux have defended. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second, which is to say, I see my work as continuous with and as informing and furthering the work of scientists. But I also think that we need to pay attention to the history of science and framing our questions and in answering them, and indeed looking at the practice of science if we're going to get right how to answer these philosophical questions about how we think about cancer, how scientific change works, and so on. So traditionally in philosophy of science, the sorts of questions that philosophers, say in the mid 20th or early 20th century, were asking were about the structure of scientific theories and the nature of scientific progress, the role of experiment, how we use models, and the nature of measurement and classification. But I think that ever since the sort of historical turn and Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, there's been a sort of shift toward looking at practice. And I take it that people like Helen Longino, who I mentioned at the beginning, this comes from a paper she wrote in 2016 as an exemplar of this. and that she takes a really close look at scientific practice and does what she calls foregrounding the background. So instead of thinking about science and scientific change from the top down, as if it's a sort of transformation in, pure theory over time, one of the things she urges us to do is to pay attention to the actual practice of science and look at the methods and strategies that frame the answers that we're giving. And she thinks that that gives us a greater opportunity for critically examining how the results of science are arrived at, and engaging with scientific inquiry in the ground, challenging how the data are created, classified, and analyzed, or used in service of testing specific causal hypotheses. And I really think more work needs to be done, in particular in the context of cancer science, and looking and foregrounding the background. So a lot of work so far in philosophical work on cancer has been looking at theory change. And I think that we need to look also at practice that really transforms how we see the subject. So I take it now that I've answered as well as I can in the time allowed, the first question. I want to talk a little bit about how philosophical work on cancer can contribute to philosophy generally and philosophy of science in particular. So where does philosophy of cancer fit in the larger scope of philosophical work? I see it actually as potentially informed by, and in fact, informing a variety of different domains in philosophy, from epistemology to metaphysics to value theory. And in fact, I drew on all of these in my book. So I drew upon philosophy of medicine in critically reflecting on the nature of disease and health. I drew upon thinking about causation and natural kinds in thinking about both how we, how we should interpret claims about cancer as a genetic or genomic disease and how we classify cancers. But I also drew on ethics and political philosophy and thinking about inductive risk and decision-making about cancer screening, as well as decision-making in the context of treatment. So I think that what's really fantastic about looking at a sort of focused area in medicine is it allows us to draw upon both formal and conceptual tools from a variety of different areas of philosophy, and also just and arrive at some interesting conclusions that feed back into these other fields in interesting ways. So I'm going to give you an illustration drawing upon my work on cancer classification. So traditional questions in philosophy of medicine typically ask these questions in a sort of big picture theoretical way. They'll say, well, what are diseases? Are diseases natural categories, or are they social constructs? How do we define disease and health? What standards ought to govern evidential reasoning in medicine? And typically these questions are asked and answered in a very big picture way. But I think that when you look at the particular practices of particular areas of medicine, you can actually find some really interesting contexts in which these questions are framed and answered that might challenge your initial sort of intuitions about how we ought to answer them more generally. So for instance, when we think about how to define disease and health and how we classify diseases, what is it? Are we arriving at anything like a natural classification? What I did in my chapter on this in the book is I started looking at the variety of ways in which cancers are classified in practice in medicine. So I looked, for instance, at the variety of different tools cancer clinicians and researchers use in classifying cancer types and subtypes. So I looked at the fact, well, a lot of times cancers are classified in terms of location, right, where they originated, the tissue or cell of origin. But there are also ways in which they're classified by subtype in terms of grade or stage, how local, how advanced they are. We might look also at shared genetic alterations, or sometimes these are biomarkers, so molecular features that help us identify which particular genes are associated, or mutations to genes are associated with cancers of this type or subtype. Or we might classify them by epigenetic features or remote etiology, such as, for instance, infection-associated cancers like HPV or smoking-induced cancers. And what I found once I started looking at all these variety of ways in which cancers are classified is that these classifications serve very different functions in different parts of science. So clinical pathological contexts, we might be interested in diagnosis and treatment, whereas in molecular classifications, we might be interested in better understanding how these cancers were caused in ways that enable better treatment or more precise treatment, perhaps. And you might think, if you're tempted by certain kinds of ideals for classification, that all these classifications will nicely and neatly form a hierarchy. So from the bottom up, we might have a particular kind of biomarker that's distinctly associated with a particular kind of cancer cell of origin and tissue of origin and location. And those specific biomarkers will, in principle, enable us to make very precise predictions about how cancer is likely to progress. But the closer it looked, it turned out that that wasn't the case. In fact, cancers arising in different tissues could have more in common genetically than cancers arising in the same tissue or the same cell of origin. And cancers with the same genetic profile may or may not necessarily progress in the same way or even respond to treatments in the same way. So what I realized is that the ideal for sort of classification in terms of bottom up, sort of essentialist thinking, where we can give a natural classification that reduces the explanatory properties of the system to its most fundamental level, didn't really work in cancer the way you might expect if you were sort of tempted by standard ways of thinking in sort of essentialist metaphysics. So I used this case to challenge certain kinds of pictures of classification and argue that actually natural kinds aren't so natural, at least in this sort of essential traditional sense, and that we needed to rethink how we classify if we want to incorporate classifications or take seriously classifications that play important roles in cancer science and medicine. So I take it that one of the things that I took my book to do was both to challenge sort of traditional metaphysical approaches and also traditional conceptions in philosophy of science. But how can philosophy of cancer engage cancer researchers, patients, and families? So I want to turn to that here briefly. In this really fabulous paper by Lucille Laplan and colleagues, they identify 4 ways in which philosophy can make an important contribution to the sciences themselves. So they argue that we can clarify scientific concepts, we can engage in critical assessment of scientific assumptions and methods, we can formulate new concepts and theories, and we can foster dialogue between sciences as well as between science and society. And they give some fantastic illustrations. I'll just mention one. Lucille Laplan's book on cancer stem cells partitions different ways in which we demarcate or define what it is to be a stem cell in ways that make rather significant differences to how we think about cancer stem cells in research and treatment contexts. And in fact, scientists who work in this field have found her clarification in terms of sort of traditional philosophical understandings of relational as opposed to other kinds of classification really useful in thinking about what a cancer stem cell is. But that's just one of many hundreds of terms and concepts that are used in cancer research that I think we would do well to critically examine. And I've taken a stab at some of these, but I think there are so many opportunities for philosophers to dig in and critically examine, for instance, how we think about stochasticity, signaling, homeostasis, the epigenetic landscape, emergence, and so on, in thinking and looking at cancer research and critically examining how these concepts are used, because they're not always used consistently, they're not operationalized consistently, and how they're operationalized actually makes a huge difference to people's lives. So here's a way that philosophers can make a real difference to cancer science and medicine. And I'm not the first to point this out. So there's some really interesting work by Thomas Pradot and his colleagues in Bordeaux, where they're looking at how and how often philosophers are making real interventions in the sciences. And so they look at patterns of citation by scientists and by philosophers of scientists and how much cross communication there is between philosophy and the sciences. And they call this philosophy in science. What they mean by that is that philosophers are using the tools of conceptual analysis and critical argumentation in order to make direct interventions into scientific conversations. And so I see this as sort of a continuity of things like what Quine and others argued, that philosophy of science and science itself are actually in conversation with one another insofar as philosophers are engaging in methodological and conceptual critique of the sort that scientists themselves are interested in doing if they want to move their science forward and be critical and reflective about how they do science. And so I don't think in a way that the philosophy of science and science itself are all that different insofar as they're having that conversation. And there are lots of vivid examples of this that they discuss in their paper, but just one actually that inspired me when I was an undergraduate. I read David Hull's book on phylogenetic inference, and his work on rethinking how we generate systematic relationships or species categories actually had a huge influence in systematics and phylogenetics itself. And so I think philosophers have an opportunity, either not just by publishing in philosophy journals, but by publishing in science journals, of making these kinds of interventions in how scientists think about their work. But there are also philosophers doing really important and interesting work that can make a contribution to patient care and clinical medicine. And I'm just going to mention a few. There are actually quite a few that I put in my bibliography, but I love Sarah Green's work on precision medicine. She's at the University of Copenhagen. There's two philosophers that I like quite a bit, Benjamin Chigny and Jonathan Fuller at Toronto and University of Pittsburgh. And they've done some really important work publishing both in science journals or clinical journals and in philosophy journals about how we organize our science, how we think about clinical judgment, how we use big data and AI in medicine. And these interventions that are, coming from the philosophical perspective of either conceptual analysis or critical analysis of reasoning in clinical medicine can have real import for patient decision-making, particularly in these gray areas where we're not always certain about what works and how it works. I also really love the work of Spencer Hay at Harvard. He's done some important work looking at the intersection of epistemology and ethics in the context of precision medicine, and thinking also about how we validate these biomarkers that are often used in service of making decisions about diagnosis and treatment. I also think that there are scientists and clinicians who are doing what I would call something very much in the spirit of philosophy. So one of my favorite gadflies is Vinaya Prasad, whose recent book is about federal regulation of and the science behind new cancer drugs. And he argues in this book that there are a lot of problems with how we're thinking about testing drugs and approving them, at least in the United States, under the criteria of the FDA. And we end up with very expensive drugs that don't necessarily benefit patients all that much. And so I see this as very much in the spirit of philosophy. He was a philosophy major as an undergrad, so I think that he counts. He's an honorary philosopher. But I think that there are so many opportunities for philosophers and either in bioethics or philosophers of science to look at examples of the sort of science policy interface and sort of critically engage in questions about whether the promises made on behalf of cancer medicine really are supported by the evidence. So Prasad argues that a lot of the surrogate endpoints that we test for in the clinical testing context don't always predict the things that we care about. So we care as a patient about overall survival. Using, say, how quickly or slowly a tumor grows may not be the best surrogate for that endpoint. Unfortunately, that's often used for approval of drugs, and drugs that are claimed to meet unmet need may or may not do that. And so there are lots of critical claims he makes in this book that are worth a closer look, especially if you ever have to make these decisions about what drugs to use. And at least in the United States, a lot of these drugs are way overhyped. So a surrogate measure of a benefit is something like the rate of growth of a tumor, or how quickly it progresses. Unfortunately, those don't necessarily serve as good measures of the kinds of things that we care about. All right. Last but not least, I want to say a little bit about where I think philosophical work on cancer needs to go next. So there are three areas where I personally think that there are a lot of ways in which philosophers of biology and medicine could make some really important interventions. First, cancer genomics, which is actually the area that I've been looking at a lot recently. Second, precision medicine. And third, cancer and public health, and in particular, addressing health inequities. But I want to emphasize that philosophers can't and shouldn't do this by themselves. They have to do this in engagement with scientists and clinicians, but also with social sciences and historians of biology and medicine. And so in my bibliography, I included a lot of recent work by social scientists, sociologists of science, who do really close interviews and engagement with the scientists themselves, and trying to better appreciate how the social structure of science is affecting the results we get. So while philosophers can analyze the logic of arguments, I think we also need to situate these in context and appreciate how scientists are doing the work, as it were, from the bottom up on the ground. So the work that I'm working on now has to do with the Cancer Genome Atlas project. This was a 10-year project funded jointly by two major institutions in the United States. What they were trying to do was track the genome of each cancer type and subtype. In particular, it was 33 major cancers, and publish a sequence of those genomes, or identify the major genes associated with each cancer type and subtype, in service of better treatment, diagnosis, and so on. But they learned a lot of complicated things along the way. And while they did advance the science of cancer genomics, there are a lot of really interesting open questions about how useful and important this is, and also just how the science was produced, and what counts as a consensus genome for each cancer type and subtype, that I think philosophers are well placed to press against and ask about. And thankfully, there's a wonderful archive run by Chris Donahue at the National Human Genome Research Institute in Washington, DC, which he's organized, where you can actually search emails and white papers and grant proposals for all of this research, and find out how the scientists were making their decisions, and think critically about the reasoning behind how this research was done. And I think this is a great opportunity for someone who's like starting their dissertation to sort of get up to speed and make some really interesting critical interventions in cancer science. Another area which is, I think, philosophers of science and bioethics and philosophers of medicine have already started to look at critically, is this precision medicine initiative. So Jim Tabery has a book forthcoming that I'm really excited about on this. And this is growing. I mean, it sort of predates the 2015 announcement by Barack Obama on behalf of the Precision Medicine Initiative. The idea is we're going to treat each patient based on their own particular molecular profile. And in the context of cancer, we're going to identify drugs that target particular biomarkers or genes mutated or associated with this cancer, or specific pathways associated with this cancer, in service of more precise medicine. But what it means to say that medicine is precise or more precise or less precise, and why we're focusing on the molecular level, I think are really big open questions. And whether the huge investment in resources that we're making in this science is going to pay off, or why not, I think are huge open questions that philosophers and bioethicists would do well to press against. Last but not least, I think that there are really interesting questions where philosophers can bring into conversation people in different disciplinary frameworks. So this slide, I'm sorry if it's not, you can't really see it very well, but this slide contains some images and titles from work by Nancy Krieger's group at Harvard. And what they've been doing is looking at patterns of association of particular kinds of breast cancer in Black versus white populations, and in particular in populations of women who have been living under Jim Crow or living under conditions of stress and anxiety and impoverishment. And what she's done is she's tracked how these kinds of conditions lead to higher rates of certain kinds of cancer, looking at sort of patterns at the epidemiological level. On the other hand, there are genetics researchers who have identified particular genetic variants that they claim predict higher rates of ER negative, which is this particularly aggressive form of breast cancer, ER negative breast cancer in Black women. And so I think this is a really interesting opportunity for philosophers of science who can bring into conversation scientists from different disciplines to look really carefully at the science behind these different approaches and try to see what kinds of presuppositions about evidence and method are being used across these different disciplinary contexts, and how that should inform our thinking about inequities in health and the much significantly higher rates of mortality from breast cancer in Black women, particularly in these populations. But like I said, I don't think we can and should do it alone. I think we can and should draw upon work by social scientists and historians of science and medicine, and put these questions in context. So I think this is an opportunity for philosophers of science to reach across disciplinary divides themselves and draw upon work by historians and sociologists of science to put in context the questions that we have, analyze the sources of data, error, methods, and of classification that are at work here, the modeling strategies, look at competing explanatory frameworks, and analyze the role of values in research. And in all of the examples I've just given, there are ample opportunities for philosophical work on these kinds of questions. Another really interesting question that I've been thinking about a lot is, what is a cancer gene? Because I mentioned earlier, this paper recently came out in Trends in Genetics that said almost every gene that we've studied can be traced in some way or other to cancer, because cancer genes are studied a lot. So what does it really mean to call something a cancer gene? I think that's a really interesting open question that's worth exploring. And this is the bibliography that I mentioned I've collected. I'm going to provide a link to the organizers, so if you want to take a look and actually suggest more additions, I'd be happy to amplify it. I just think there's so many important things to do in this field, and I'm really excited to see what comes next. But I also wanted to just briefly stop before I ended and say something about being a woman in philosophy and some of the challenges that I faced. So cancer science is massive and complicated. There are more publications in cancer science than any other area of medicine. And so it can feel incredibly overwhelming. And one of the struggles that I faced in writing my book was feeling that I was confident enough to have an understanding of the science to publish a book on this immense topic. But one of the things I had to do was to say to myself, okay, I'm going to narrow my scope. I'm going to specify my questions. I'm going to resist taking ambitions on that maybe are a bit too broad, and be willing to let go. I think that women philosophers feel especially pressed to prove themselves, to take on hard topics, to work hard. I'm not going to say harder, to work very hard to try to prove that they're up to the standard of the profession. And I think that that sometimes leads us to undermine ourselves and to question our abilities in ways that, that unfortunately prevents us from doing as much as we can and making as many contributions as we can and should to the field. So I think that I just wanted to say that we're all in that position, and it's okay to sort of let go. You could always be better, that there's more people down the road who are going to keep building this field, and I hope that we do. So I wanted to thank the organizers and welcome your questions. And I've been really grateful for this opportunity to sort of sit back and think about my own work and the future of the field. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anya, for this great talk. Many important topics raised. Let's give her a round of applause. Now you're open for questions. you can type your question in the chat. And let's see. Okay, as there is no manifestation yet, I have a question to start. And a concern that I have when it comes to this area of research, and maybe you can help us understand this better. As it seems for your 4 questions are related with interdisciplinarity in different areas. And the question is, where philosophy finishes and where science starts, or both are just intertwined along all the way, because sometimes it's difficult to have that clear, especially when teaching philosophy students. How do you see this issue?
Well, that's a fantastic question. So I guess the short answer is, let me see here. The short answer is I don't think that there is a sharp distinction. I think that the best scientists I know, the scientists who are really critical and reflective, are philosophers, in the sense that they're asking hard questions about how they define their terms and concepts, what kinds of evidential criteria they're relying upon. And as soon as they start asking these questions about which methods are best or how we ought to prefer this sort of standard of evidence over that, they're actually doing philosophy, because they're engaging in inquiry into methodology and standards of evidence in ways that are continuous with philosophical questions that are at the core of philosophy of medicine. For instance, like the sort of debate about mechanism and evidence-based medicine. Ought we to prioritize our RCTs and systematic reviews? Those sorts of questions are actually questions that are central to scientific practice. So some people think, well, that's somehow a problem because it's as if I'm blurring the boundaries between disciplines. But actually, if you look back in the history of philosophy, people like Rene Descartes and Newton, they called themselves natural philosophers, and they weren't just doing science, they were also inquiring into the nature of inquiry. And so I don't think it's actually that radical to suggest that the philosophy of science and the sciences are tightly intertwined, and the best kind of science is science that's philosophically engaged in questions about method and evidence and conceptual clarity and so on.
Fantastic, Amy. Thanks a lot for your response. And let's see. Any manifestation in the chat? So another question, and that it's important for me because it's a topic that I just started researching, and that's related to overdiagnosis. I know your remarkable contribution to this topic, and my concern here is that from the epistemological point of view, knowing the truth is one of the main goals of philosophy. But from the perspective of the everyday practice of medicine, searching for the truth considered here as knowing about your own health condition by, for example, screening tests, as it commonly happens when a cancer is found. Knowing is not always welcome, and you touching this topic in your talk. So it seems here medicine imposes a limiting perspective on epistemological endeavor. What do you think about it?
So is the question here, are there contexts in which I might not want to know, or in which I might be better off being ignorant? And is that a challenge to philosophy or philosophers' presuppositions? Well, I actually don't know if it is. I think that there are philosophers nowadays who are starting to say that, ignorance can sometimes be a good thing. I mean, I think it really depends on the context, right? And I also think that when we think about knowledge of the truth being a virtue, I think there are often trade-offs between different kinds of truthful information we might want, and in service of different goals. And I'm not the first to say this, of course. So when you talk about scientific modeling, for instance, you might want a model that has wide scope as opposed to precision, right? And so how you develop your model and how you test your hypothesis might involve trading one kind of truthful information for another kinds of truthful information. And that's part and parcel of how science works. And I think that philosophers assume that the truth is the truth. That's all that's all that we want often. But I don't think I think that more sophisticated philosophers have started to question that and recognize that there are different kinds of truthful information, that we trade off different goals. So I guess I'm a bit of a pragmatist about this. Not in some senses of pragmatism, but yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Now we have here a question from Professor Ivan.
Oh, hi. Anya, the talk has been great. I think your work is amazing. You're dealing with such an exciting topic with a really, I think, with some complexity that presentation be a real inspiration to a lot of the students and a lot of the people who are watching us. And one point about the end of your talk, I think it was quite interesting because you addressed the point that cancer is a very complex phenomenon. I mean, there are some aspects which are biological, physical, chemical, and also social, cultural, and statistical and populational. And and philosophy of science, as I think you understand it, and I understand it that way too, might be a place for all these different perspectives to dialogue. I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about that, if you can. How do you see this connection between the many areas, how dialogue takes place in philosophy? That's it, though. Thank you for your talk once more.
I guess I'm not entirely sure how to answer the question because it's so big. Let's see. I mean, one of the nice things about looking at medicine is it's one of these places where methodological questions and value-laden questions come into intersection. And so you can sort of test out some philosophical issues that have been addressed at a sort of an abstract level in this more concrete context. So for instance, one of the big issues that I've looked at and in the context of cancer is this problem of inductive risk. So going back to Richard Redner in the 1950s, the argument is something like this. When scientists decide to accept or reject a hypothesis, they make certain kinds of judgments about what the risk of error is in one direction or another. So the risk of accepting a hypothesis when it's false or rejecting a hypothesis when it's true. And that when you make those trade-offs, you might set your standards of evidence at different levels in light of your preference for certain kinds of risk over others. And when you think about your preference for certain kinds of risk over others, you might be thinking about the downstream consequences of these alternative acceptances or rejections. And in medicine, this arises in a variety of ways, both in the context of setting policy for cancer screening, but then also decision-making at the individual level. And so there's really interesting opportunities here for philosophers to think about how inductive risk comes into play, both in how we set policy for, say, cancer screening, or set regulations for the acceptance or rejection of approval of a drug, or in particular contexts of individual decision-making, say if we want to choose a more aggressive or less aggressive mode of treatment. And so I think that these are opportunities for philosophers to bring to bear conceptual distinctions and arguments going back 50 years, 70 years now in philosophy of science into the context of cancer medicine and health policy, and shed light on some of these debates that policymakers and clinicians and indeed patients and their families are having about how to decide and what to decide on. And so I think that philosophers can bring into conversation the sort of the science and the policy in interesting and useful ways. I don't know if that addresses your question. It was such a big question. I don't know if I could possibly address it. Yeah. Thank you for your question, Ivan.
Anya, how do you think the pandemic influenced the research on philosophy of medicine?
Oh, wow, that's a great question. There's been some fantastic work done on that. Both, I think, sort of written by and for philosophers. So in philosophy journals and journals like HPLS and Studies, and people have made some great contributions there. But I think that also one of the things that is really interesting to me about what's happened as a result of the pandemic is a lot more philosophers have seen their role as more public facing and engaging with a wider public. And so several philosophers like Jonathan Fuller and Alex Broadbent and others have been doing more public facing work, either by being producing or being involved with things like documentaries or public conversations, or writing for a more public audience about the pandemic, and showing how philosophical thinking about science and medicine and public health can make a big difference to addressing these hard questions about both how to communicate about the science and how to set policy. Because I think a lot of people nowadays are just confused, right? There's, how do these things work? How do we make these decisions? I think people have a lot of sometimes very naive or simple-minded views about how cancer epidemiology or epidemiology in general and public health work. They tend to think that, well, if it's science, it must be certain, which of course, now we're watching science in action, it's a lot less clear cut. So we've raised the veil, and I think that philosophers of science can kind of help us negotiate that process of recognizing that, there are a lot of gray areas in science, that it's the work in progress, there's a lot of uncertainty, and in setting science policy, we're trading off various kinds of precaution that are really, these are hard choices to make. And so I think philosophy of science has a role to play in communicating about those things.
Yeah, for me, I think the people knowing that the science is not that precise and that full of uncertainties, I think it was the most difficult thing to face in this pandemic. And I've seen someone saying that science, it's like more like philosophy, because we face so many uncertainties in this months. Yeah. Well, I have here a question. I don't know from whom. From Talita. The question is, you mentioned a continuity between science and philosophy. You also agree that there is a continuity between the common sense and science? If yes, how do you deal with this in the times of negationism, when people want and need a demarcation between common sense and science?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'm not so sure I would agree that there's continuity between common sense and, was it common sense and science? I don't know what common sense is. I have a sense that psychologists have shown that by and large, people are just really irrational. People make bad decisions, they have bad common sense. We all have various heuristics and biases that shape our thinking. We want to believe things that we like, and we don't want to believe things that we don't like. We want to believe things that people like us agree upon. We want to be part of a community of people that with shared beliefs and values. And all of those things inform our common sense in ways that probably don't always lead us to the truth. So I take it that one of the goals of science is to try to correct those patterns of error and bias and all those heuristics that we have that might have helped us get along in, small groups. I don't know, hunting or something, but maybe not so much in understanding the way the world works. I don't know if I don't want to dismiss the question though, so maybe I haven't really addressed it.
No, I think it's okay. She's stressing that people are needing a demarcation now. Yeah. Anya, well, thinking about natural kinds, I was thinking about the HeLa cells and how it fits in all this research on cancer.
Oh, fantastic. That's a great example. Yeah, so one of the things I actually talk about in the book is what is a cancer cell? And the problem with answering this question is that what we study in the lab isn't necessarily the same as what we study is what a cancer cell is like in the body. Because in order to grow up cancer cells in the lab, they have to be quite different than what we find in the body. Because if you put a cancer cell from the body just on a plate and try to grow it, it'll die. And so there's a really interesting question here about what counts as a cancer cell and what makes it this cancer cell. Is this a relational property? Is it importantly informed by the environment that it's in? Or is it something that is sort of intrinsic to the cell itself? And I think the presupposition that a lot of philosophers tend to have is, well, we have to find the essence, right? We have to find these intrinsic properties unique and distinctive to cancer cells. And if we just look at, say, the molecular products of particular mutations or the particular, sort of internal properties of the cell, we'll be able to discriminate what a cancer cell is. But it turns out that that doesn't really always help us that much because for instance, you can have all of the mutations typical of a cancer cell and be a healthy cell on the surface of my skin. So there's a fantastic study that used eye lifts from women who had had surgery. So they had skin from women who had had like these eye lifts that they then looked at the skin and they found as many mutations in those skin cells as you would have in a cancer cell. But because our skin cell is constantly shedding, these never became cancers. So it's really interesting, like, would position itself determine what counts as a cancer cell? So I think, this HeLa cell as an example is a really nice one because HeLa cells are used.
Do you mind explaining what is?
Oh yeah, sorry. Maybe you could help me. If you there's a wonderful book about this. I don't know if people are familiar with Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. But she talks about the history of HeLa cells. They were drawn from an African-American woman in, I believe it was Baltimore, right? Who had a cervical cancer. And it was one of the first cells that was that they could grow up in culture. And it's now been used all over the world to do cancer research. But it's in some sense artificial. It's different from the kinds of cells we would find in the body because, like I said, most of those would die. And so there's a really interesting question of using those as representative for the research on cancer, whether they really count as analogous or similar enough. And I think there's really interesting questions there, just as a philosopher, like, well, which of these is the cancer cell or representative of a cancer cell? Yeah, great example.
Thanks a lot, Anya. Well, I think we don't have any questions anymore. Well, many thanks again, Anya. You we are so grateful to have you here in our event in Brazil, and hopefully you can meet in person soon. You presented us with many resources, and I think you also will be a representative and important person as a reference for us here studying this topic. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody who was here with us today and that is watching later also. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope we can see each other in person sometime soon.
Definitely. Bye-bye, all the best.